Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Apologies that we're running a little bit late. For those of you who live in Austin, you know traffic. All I have to say is traffic. We all know why we're late. But we're glad you're here, and it should be a wonderful program. My name is Erin Purdy. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Briscoe Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to our program with award-winning journalist Chris Wallace in conversation with our founding Executive Director, Don Carlton. We are here tonight for a very important reason. We are celebrating Chris Wallace's donation to the Briscoe Center of his papers. Yes. The papers document his stellar career as a journalist. They're an outstanding addition to the Center's collections of news media history, one of the most comprehensive archives in existence, documenting the history of American print and broadcast news media. Our archive measures roughly 3 miles of shelf space, consists of hundreds of separate collections, and provides rich source material on the role of news media and its impact on American society, not to mention documentary evidence of significant events in our shared past. The news media collections include the personal papers of industry pioneers and leaders, research archives, oral histories, newspapers, and audio and video recordings, as well as one of the largest archives of American photojournalism in existence. Legendary CBS newsman Walter Cronkite entrusted his papers to the Center in the late 1980s and launched the program. Our holdings now include the papers of Morley Safer, Andy Rooney, Wayne Barrett, Jules Witcover, Harry Reasoner, and Robert Trout, nationally renowned columnists such as Walter Winchell, Molly Ivins, and Liz Smith, Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist Ben Sargent, Vanity Fair writer and commentator Dominick Dunne, and writer and magazine editor Terry McDonell, just to name a few. And now, Mr. Wallace. It is particularly fitting that his papers join those of Walter Cronkite, who gave Wallace one of his first jobs in journalism, which I think we're going to learn more about tonight. So let me introduce our speakers. Chris Wallace is a veteran journalist with over 5 decades of experience across broadcast television, cable television, streaming, print, and independent content creation. Over the course of his career, he's reported on national and international affairs at the highest level, giving him a deep understanding of politics and global relations. Chris has served as a correspondent, moderator, or anchor on NBC, ABC, Fox News, and CNN. His work has been recognized with virtually every major broadcast news award, including 3 Emmys, the DuPont-Columbia Silver Baton, the Peabody Award, the Polk Award, and the Paul White Award for Lifetime Achievement. After his graduation from Harvard University, Chris was a reporter at the Boston Globe. He soon moved into broadcast news and worked for NBC from 1978 to 1989, including 6 years as chief White House correspondent during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. He also anchored Meet the Press. He then served as chief correspondent for ABC's Primetime for 14 years, as well as chief substitute anchor for Ted Koppel on Nightline. Chris then worked for Fox News for 18 years and hosted Fox News Sunday, making him the only person to host 2 Sunday morning news programs. He remains the first and only Fox News anchor to moderate a general election presidential debate in 2016 and again in 2020. Most recently, he spent 3 years at CNN as the anchor of the weekly political program, The Chris Wallace Show, as well as a host of the interview show, Who's Talking to Chris Wallace? He was also a top analyst for CNN's coverage of the U.S. presidential debates and election. More recently, he's the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books, Countdown, 1945, Countdown Bin Laden, and Countdown 1960. I'm very pleased to tell you I just learned he's working on the next Countdown book, so there's another one on the way. And I should mention that the recognition of his career achievements now includes a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, just added last month, and his star is next to that of his late father, Mike Wallace. So the papers, they capture the breadth of his career and include television scripts, photographs, audio recordings, correspondence, clippings, and reporters' notes. The papers also include extensive amounts of archival video footage from which we've pulled some clips to share with you tonight. You're going to learn a lot more about those papers in the conversation that will follow, which will be led by Don Carlton, the founding executive director of the Briscoe Center, a specialist in American political and news media history. He has authored or co-authored 15 books and has served as executive producer of 2 PBS documentaries, When I Rise and Cactus Jack, Lone Star on Capitol Hill. Speaking of Walter Cronkite, Don worked with Walter Cronkite over a period of 3 years on Cronkite's best-selling memoir, A Reporter's Life, and as a result, the two forged a close relationship and friendship that lasted until Cronkite's death in 2009. Don's book, Conversations with Cronkite, was published the following year. Little housekeeping note after we conclude the conversation this evening, you are all invited to join us for a reception at the Briscoe Center. We are just up the stairs and across the breezeway. We'll have staff on hand to guide you. So please join me in welcoming Chris Wallace and Don Carlton to the stage.
It's going to look like I'm working on a book while we're talking, but
Okay.
I'm not. I'm going to be. Thank you, Chris, for being here tonight. Thank you for this tremendous gift that is a great, really outstanding addition to our holdings. We have people coming from all over the world to use our news media collections. You will not be surprised to hear that that's currently a hot topic these days. I know that's a shock, but I am going to ask some questions here that I want to open this up. And
Can I just say one thing before you do?
Sure.
First of all, thank you all so much for coming tonight through the wind and the traffic. I am so tickled to be here. We had a house in Washington, my wife and I, and also a place in Annapolis. And because I'm not working full time, we decided to move to Annapolis. And I didn't realize how many dozens of boxes from my days at Harvard to the Boston Globe to local TV news in Chicago to NBC to ABC and on. And, you know, what was I going to do with all this stuff? And I just hated the idea that I was going to throw it away, but on the other hand, it didn't occur to me anybody would be interested. And so I did some research and had some people, including James Gregorio here, who represented me, to find where, on the off chance that they'd be interested, where is the premier repository for news media papers in the country. Turns out to be a place called the Briscoe Center. And then I think it was James called and said, by any chance would you be interested?
Yes, it was James.
Yes.
And I said, I've got a station wagon. I can come up tomorrow.
And he said, bring a couple of station wagons. In any case, I just couldn't be more thrilled that all of this work, and you know, it's my credentials going back to conventions, to presidential trips with Reagan. It's scripts, articles from when I was a cub reporter at the Boston Globe and on throughout my entire career. And I guess my hope is that somebody, someday, hopefully a lot of people often, will find some use in it. And one of the things that, as I was going through it, I thought was, man, I did a lot of work. I really worked hard preparing my stories, the research, to tell the American people what was going on. And I hope somebody will go through it and say, you know, at some point they'll say, gee, this really helps me understand what went on in the first, in the third, actually, the last Trump-Clinton debate of 2016, or what went on this particular issue with Ronald Reagan in 1985. So I hope it'll be of service, and I'm very, very grateful to you for accepting it.
Well, thank you. Well, I can guarantee you the collection will be, as I tell our donors that we're not in the dead storage business. And so we work our collections and we bring in scholars and we produce research ourselves and we publish books and do, as you heard, documentary film. And it's all based on our holdings and our collections. And as you saw, we have exhibits and so your collection's going to have a very happy home here, Chris. So. Speaking of what we do, and we have 2 or 3 distinguished historians here tonight as well, and they're very familiar with why this material is important for history, for not only teaching but for research. So I want to just take a minute to explain to I think we have some new folks here, why we established the Briscoe Center's News Media Archive. One of my areas as a historian has been the history of the news media and its impact on our political system. In my research as a doctoral student many years ago, I became aware of the real need for an archive documenting when the news, what the news covers and how it's put together. So I just want to explain that the center, as a center, our program, we do not collect copies of radio or television broadcasts or published print journalism. We have plenty of examples of the products of your profession. But that kind of material has been collected more comprehensively for many years by other institutions. Vanderbilt University, for example, has a fantastic, they've been copying news broadcasts forever. Our efforts have really been aimed at collecting and preserving the records documenting the backstory of how news has been gathered and produced in all formats. And in other words, how have journalists worked in the past? I'd put it another way, how was the news sausage made? And like sausage, it's really made behind the scenes. And what you see on television or hear on the radio or reading the newspaper, you don't really see the background. And that's why your collection is so important, because it's a working journalist archive. And surprisingly, very little bit of that kind of collecting had been going on until we got in the business, frankly, because all of the focus was basically on the product, getting the newspapers, getting the television show, this sort of thing. So that's also why because of this interest in making the sausage, the news sausage, we've collected the archives of news editors and news producers, for example, as well as the paper's reporters. Now, Aaron mentioned a few of the journalists whose papers that are now at the Briscoe Center, and I should add that we also have the extensive research files of Newsweek magazine, as well as those of 2 long gone but historically important newspapers, the New York Herald Tribune and the Hearst Company's New York Journal-American. All those are gold mines for historians and doing research. And I'm not saying that we've got the Newsweek magazines, those are in the library. We have all of their research records, which have filled up a tractor-trailer truck. Now, so Chris, your papers are in good company. In fact, they'll think they're even better company with you there, and we're delighted to have them. Now, as I would expect most of you know, Chris has been directly involved, as Aaron really did a good job of laying out here, an amazing number of historically significant news stories. I mean, I thought I had followed your career in depth, but it just blew my mind. The things that you've covered, the places you've been involved in. And it's really a history of our last several decades, frankly. And of course, he's also interviewed just about everyone of importance over the past few decades as well. And I have to admit to all of you that before we begin, that despite my experience conducting a very large number of oral history interviews over my career, including some really tough interviewees like Barbara Walters and Andy Rooney. They were both lots of fun. Andy was a good friend, but still, he was a tough interview. I don't know if you ever had a chance to actually interview Andy?
No,
or no?
I
Okay.
talked to him though.
Yeah, of course.
I'm a pussycat compared to him.
I mean, I remember one time I was interviewing Andy at his little cubbyhole there at CBS, in the broadcast, and he said, that's the dumbest question I've ever heard. He said, "You're better than that, Don Carlton." I said, "Oh, okay." He said, "That sounds like a Barbara Walters question." So anyway, because of that, I find it a bit intimidating to interview someone who's considered to be really among the very best interviewers in the history of broadcast journalism. And I say that not to blow smoke at a good donor here, but also I've done some research looking into how Chris stands with news critics, not newspaper people, or journalists, but people, television critics and so forth. And he has time after time after time it's been said that you are among the very best interviewers that's ever been in broadcast journalism. So that is intimidating.
I think you'll get over it.
Well, let's give it a shot.
Okay.
Okay. So sadly, we only have a relatively short time to talk tonight, and you've covered so much. So let's get started with the slides of some sample. We can go ahead and let's get in a position where you can see what we're looking at here. The document really what we're starting. We've got a couple of, we haven't had the papers for a long time, and we haven't had a chance to completely catalog them yet, but we do have a good indication, understanding of the contents. So I'm just throwing up a couple of things here because most of you don't really, probably for good reason, have any experience in working with original papers and original evidence and documents. And so I just want to throw a couple of examples up here because occasionally, not for you, but occasionally I get questions about why would we want to save reporters' papers? What's in those? So I just want to show a couple of things. What you're looking at here, this particular image is a transcript issued by the Republican Party of Senator Barry Goldwater's acceptance speech for the Republican presidential nomination in July 1964. Now, this is not a particularly rare or valuable document, but you would be surprised how quickly these things disappear. They're handouts, they're ephemeral, and they often go in the trash can. So this is actually an important, and I don't know if those are your annotations or not. It's too long ago for you to remember, but for some reason.
No, that curve, that's mine.
That's your curve.
No, the significance of this, though, is this was my first job in journalism. I was, in 1964, the Republican convention at the Cow Palace, which was just outside San Francisco. I was 16 years old, and I was the gopher for Walter Cronkite. When I say gopher, go for coffee, go for pencils. I was in the anchor booth with Walter Cronkite and Eric Severide at the age of 16. And if this is in the papers, then I saved this. And I can remember, it was so fascinating. Eisenhower was there, Rockefeller, who was considered by the Goldwater wing of the Republican Party, which was then ascendant, kind of a communist, and they literally booed him off the podium. And I remember being there in the anchor booth with Cronkite and thinking to myself, I cannot believe people get paid to do this. This seems like the most exciting way in the world to make a living. So my 55-year career in journalism, this is the rosebud. This is where it all came from. Just being at that convention, looking out and thinking, what could be more exciting than to be at news? It's obviously interesting events. People are following it because they're fascinated by it, and to be able to go places and see things and meet people and then go tell. I know I wasn't doing any of that. I was getting coffee for Walter Cronkite, but I thought that's a good way to make a living. And one other part to this story: my father, Mike Wallace, was a correspondent on the floor. What you probably don't know is my stepfather was named Bill Leonard, and he was the head of the CBS News election unit, and which is really how I got the job. And in those days, I guess now they'd call me a Nuppo baby, but in those days the idea was that, and it was just routine, that the sons and daughters of the anchors and the reporters and the producers were hired to work at the conventions, and the thought was it'll be an opportunity for them to get to find out how their mom and dad works and why they're away so often. And in my case, it's where the bug bit.
Was Walter intimidating for a 16-year-old?
No. Actually, he was very nice, but Eric Severide, who some of you may remember, was intimidating. And actually, I told this story to somebody the other day. Before we went to the convention, the week before, we were in the San Francisco Hilton, and Severide, for those of you who may remember, was this very tall, majestic Norwegian figure, jut-jawed, and great mane of hair, and he smoked a cigarette. Everybody smoked cigarettes in those days, out of a cigarette holder, which most people didn't. And I was standing next to one of the wire machines. I'd have to rip off the copy and distribute it in the newsroom. And I'm next to Eric Severide, and the cigarette fell out of his cigarette holder. And so I'm like, what do I do now? I'm 16. So I pick up the cigarette, and I hand it back, Mr. Severide, and he just went. So he was a little intimidated.
So let's look at the next image we've got here. This is a file. We picked this folder out. It's a really good example of how a journalist worked in sort of the pre-digital, pre-iPhone period. This is just a good example of the kind of material that's in the folders that a reporter would build as they were covering a story. Some of it's back matter, some of it, and so forth. You've got, it looks like there's a transcript where you've marked up. Is that in the middle? Does that look like your markings? Because
no, that's my script.
Yeah, that's what I thought, because in your
that's
folder.
my script, and there's a handout from a congressman, and
This
was interesting. This is 3 Mile Island, and this is the spring of '79. And what's interesting here is that I had been in local TV news in Chicago working for the CBS affiliate, and the CBS network asked me to. I was a pretty good reporter, and they said, would you come work for CBS News? And between my father and my stepfather both being there, I thought, this is not a good idea. So I went to work for the local NBC station in New York, and then I went to the network in '78 in Washington. And I think this is like one of my very first stories.
This is '79.
Yeah, this is '79, but it was one of the very first stories where I went out on the road, because I went to 3 Mile Island. I was based in Washington and covering Congress. If you can see that scratching there, one of my either advantages or disadvantages is my handwriting was always terrible, so the only person who could read it was me, which I don't know if that was good or bad. And my marking it up, I would do it better now, was I had to write a script, and then I had to read the script.
Was it stand-up? Was this?
Well, part of it was, part of it wasn't. But my point is, I was sort of like, what are the words where are you gonna pause, where are you gonna emphasize, and that's what I was doing.
So when you notice you get clippings here, and he also has a diagram of 3 Mile Island's nuclear reactor. just, the things that you gather and trying to get background and understand the story you're reporting on.
Yeah.
So that's, let's
And
see.
then I did what anybody does, is I clipped articles out of the New York Times.
Yeah. Yeah, we used to kid Walter about, before you do your news program, you need to be sure and read the New York Times. He used to not like that.
Right.
But anyway, so let's see the next. But anyway, that's a sample of the kind of research material is in the collection. Okay, let's this clip. Hang on before you play it. I just want to say. So this is okay. So you've got a large collection of video recordings in your papers, which are great. And this one, let's start with this interview you conducted with Nancy Reagan in July 1985, which we have little clips here, and I want you to react to them or make comments.
Okay.
People I talk to say that you can be pretty demanding, that when you want something, you want it now. And in fact, one of the words that I heard repeatedly used about you is she can be relentless. True?
Well, I think I know what I want. But actually, I would think that if I were working for somebody, I would rather work for somebody who knew what they wanted.
And you don't leave any doubts?
No. But isn't that easier?
Okay, Chris, so tell us a little bit about
working
with
this
Nancy
was a
Reagan.
very smart idea of the then president of NBC News. I was the White House correspondent for 6 years. And in '85, Reagan had won a landslide election. In '84, he said, I think there's a really interesting documentary to do about Nancy Reagan, because to those of you who are old enough to remember, she was famous for staring lovingly at her husband, what was known as the gaze, as if she'd never heard this before, even if it was the fourth time that day she had heard what he was saying. But he suggested, now that they're never going to run for office again, maybe she wants to tell her story. And everybody knew that she had played a big role behind the scene. And so I went to her office and asked, an NBC hour documentary about Mrs. Reagan and her role and her projects and her importance in her husband's political career. And she said yes, which proved the Larry Grossman, the president's point, which was she's ready to tell her story. And if you remember, she was very involved in the Just Say No program about drugs. During the course of this trip, the documentary, she went to Rome and met with the Pope, not as the First Lady, but as the head of this anti-drug program. And so here we were there in the living quarters, in the living room in the White House, and I had gone to a number of the top aides, and they had all used the same word. They'd all said she is relentless. She wants, not so much on policy, although sometimes on there, but particularly on personnel. She knew what she wanted, and she was going to get it. And Reagan, who had these big thoughts and was a very effective president, didn't like having to kind of muscle people. He was very non-confrontational in a personal sense. Nancy was very confrontational in a personal sense, and she had no problem at all telling the staff, this is what we want.
Well, after your interview, this interview we just saw a little clip of, you wrote First Lady book, a portrait of Nancy Reagan.
Right.
That was and that came out a year later. So, I mean, you got to be around the Reagans quite a bit.
Yes,
in
and
your
as
career.
part of this, I also, I think was the only reporter invited up to Camp David, where I interviewed the two of them together.
At Camp David, yeah.
And also, I just saw a second there, a clip.
Yeah.
We went to the ranch too and interviewed the two of them there.
I've seen there's a picture in your collection of you working there at the ranch there above Santa Barbara. So let's look at the next clip here. The next clip is from your interview. You'll all most of you will recognize. The next clip is from your interview with disgraced former President Richard Nixon, who was a guest on NBC's Meet the Press when you were the moderator. This is in April of 1988, 14 years after he resigned as president. And you were hosting, of course, Meet the Press, as you well know. So let's see this clip.
Delighted to have you with us. And as we welcome you, I should also note that your first appearance on Meet the Press was back in September of 1952 when you were running for vice president. And we thought you might like to take a look at a brief clip from that program.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest on Meet the Press is Senator Richard Nixon, Republican of California.
I predict that millions of Democrats this year, both North and South, are going to put their country above their party and vote for General Eisenhower. And I believe that that's going to be the decisive factor in an Eisenhower victory.
Well, Mr. President, what do you think of that fellow compared to the politicians you see these days?
Well, that's one of the first times I've ever seen myself on television. As I was telling you before the show began, I simply have a phobia about that. But I must say I looked a bit younger then, but I was.
What a sense of humor he had. I'll tell you an interesting story. So he resigned in disgrace in 1974 and went to San Clemente, wrote some books. And now this is 1988. In the mid-'80s, he began to think, because he was a brilliant man and obviously had enormous capacity, enormous demons as well, and he decided that he wanted to reemerge and wanted to start having an impact on policy and politics. And he went out of his way to reach out to people or to accept invitations from people who hadn't been around during Watergate, hadn't been in Washington and covered it. And I was too young I was working at a local station in Chicago at the time. And so he agreed to meet me at the hotel he was staying at in Washington, sort of as a break the ice, see whether he could trust me. And I remember I went, it was the damnedest thing. Like all of you, at that point, I'd spent my entire life watching Richard Nixon on the air, reporting not on him specifically, but things about him when I was a local reporter in Chicago. And suddenly I'm in a room with Richard Nixon in this hotel, and I know what it is. He's basically auditioning to me, like, does he trust that I will give him a fair interview? And I remember I asked him a number of questions on a number of subjects. Reagan had had a couple of Supreme Court nominees kicked out. There was some political issues. And he had utterly cogent answers on every question. And I remember I went back to the White House after. I was the White House correspondent for NBC. And I wrote up notes, which I don't have. And I'm very sorry that they're not in the collection, of everything he said, which was utterly logical, perfectly cogent, and as it turned out, all wrong. Every single one of his predictions of what was going to happen was wrong. But the other thing I remember was sitting in this room alone with him for about an hour and thinking, this is the best Richard Nixon impersonation I have ever seen. This guy does a better Nixon than anybody, better than Rich Little, better than any of these other guys. He was just full of the tics and all the little things that you saw there. And I was thrilled to get the opportunity. It was interesting. NBC knew when he agreed to do, and I was the host of Meet the Press, so they had Tom Brokaw and John Chancellor also do the interview with me. And it was, one of those memorable moments when you sit there and say, this is pretty great.
Yeah, I could imagine that. That's one of the reasons we picked this clip. And was that the only time you got to interview the ex-president?
Yeah.
Nixon?
Yeah.
Okay, so the next clip is going to be from your 1993 interview with Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, who was among those responsible for the massive explosion in the underground parking lot of the World Trade Center in February of 1993, an event that's sort of been obscured in some ways by what eventually happened, the terrible thing. So let's see that.
He is known around the world now as the incendiary Islamic minister who preaches holy war against the government of Egypt and is said to be the shadowy figure behind the World Trade Center bombing. But when we caught up with Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman this week, it was in this quiet neighborhood near Los Angeles. Outside one home, federal agents who follow the sheikh everywhere he goes. Inside, the 55-year-old blind cleric received us on the floor of a small bedroom.
You came in peace and you were peacefully received and respected.
One of his followers calls the sheikh a 16th century man caught in a 20th century world. But others say he's a canny politician. The Wallace message to his followers is filled with talk of enemies and violence. He tries to charm outsiders with a tone of moderation, and in our case, a little English.
I speak 10 words.
10 words?
So tell us about that. I mean, how did that get put together or
Well,
arranged?
this is part of a career. So I had done, when I was on the Today Show, I was a co-anchor of the Today Show for about a year before they kicked me out. I don't know why, they just didn't think I was a kind of morning personality. They were right, my wife says so. In any case, I had done an interview with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and what happens is you build a network of contacts and people who feel they don't expect you to do a puff piece about Muammar Gaddafi, but they feel they get a, no pun intended, a fair shake. And but so you do that interview, and then the person who was the go-between there, you go back to who has contacts in the Middle East. Now, what was interesting here was that the bombing of the World Trade Center in the garage had taken place, but he was not arrested. He was an incendiary, rabble-rousing sheikh in this country, I think preaching out of, Brooklyn, and they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him, which is why they were surveilling him. And I remember when talking through my Gaddafi contact to some other contact or whatever, somehow, I was working at that time for a show at ABC called Primetime, which was a magazine show, and they were interested in doing it, and they said, well, he's traveling up the West Coast because he wants to see the coastline. And I remember saying, excuse me, but isn't he blind? It's that kind of cogent, getting to the point question that carried me for half a century. In any case, they said, yes, but he wants to see it with his soul. So in any case, he agreed to the interview, and we went and we did it there. And, he was in a relatively moderate way espousing his views about the Middle East, and certainly denying that he had anything to do with the bombing of the World Trade Center. Very shortly thereafter, he was arrested, and is he still alive? I think he's gone, but he certainly spent the rest of his life in prison.
Yeah, I don't know.
That picture of the two of us in that lotus position on the floor, although there were couches and chairs all over the place, ended up on the front page of the New York Times, and I have a copy of that.
So on a thing like that, I mean,
actually, you have a copy of that. I said,
yeah, that's what I say. We have a copy of that.
I don't have anything.
By the way, we need those notes you were talking about that we don't have. You need to give those to us. Okay. The question I have about that, this is before he was arrested.
Right.
So, and this would be a kind of a question about larger work that you've done too, or other work, and that is the relationship when you were interviewing people or doing a story that the FBI was investigating, let's say. Were there ever any questions from the FBI about when you were doing interviews? Did you ever have any, did they ever raise?
Want to see your notes or whatever?
Yeah.
No, but, I think as opposed perhaps to a newspaper person, we were going to put all the best stuff on the air. So, anything that was at all incriminating, we were hardly going to hide. We were going to put it on the air. So, I don't know. Now you're making me feel bad. No, the FBI never reached me. It never reached out to me.
Well, it's a question, you know, obviously, that people wonder about.
Right. I mean, and the answer would have been, you know, I don't, in those days, I don't think we provided outtakes.
You mean to the FBI?
Or to,
to anybody.
To anybody,
to
yeah.
anybody,
I mean,
yeah.
it was like, you know,
Yeah.
we gave you the final.
Right.
There's got to be an interesting thing with CBS because remember, the internet didn't exist then. So,
Right.
you know, it's not like you could put out outtakes. You remember when 60 Minutes did the interview with Kamala Harris and Trump ended up suing for, I don't know, $100 billion or $20 billion or something. He ended up getting $16 million from Paramount. And one of the things was that they said, I guess they asked for the transcripts and the outtakes, you know, because their argument was that this had been, you know, deceptively edited to make Kamala Harris look good, and thereby disadvantage Donald Trump. Not that that was the basis for a legitimate lawsuit. But in any case, and CBS refused to do it, and I always thought that was stupid. I always thought, you know, why not just, with the internet now, and oftentimes networks have done that when they say, you know, they've done an hour interview and they end up running 20 minutes. If you want to see the full interview, you go to abcnews.com or whatever. So I never understood why, because had they put that out, I think it actually would have helped them and hurt President Trump's case.
Do you have any wild guess why they would be so rigid about that?
I think they were fighting the last war. I think 60 Minutes, well, this is the interesting thing. 60 Minutes claimed that they had never done that they had never put out the entire unedited interview, but somebody, and there's always somebody doing research, found out that there were a half dozen times when, in fact, they had done that.
Probably the Westmoreland case, General Westmoreland.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah.
But in any case, you know, I know it's often happened where networks that I've worked at, I know it happened at ABC, because they had to cut down an interview, would say, you can go to abcnews.com and see the entire interview. And in that particular case, when they had nothing to hide, why not do it?
Yeah. Interesting. Going back to the Sheik here a second, though, I want to, where were you on 9/11?
I was in Washington, D.C. I was working, continuing to work for Primetime, so I was not, you know, on a basic story, but I remember as soon as, I was at home when you know, it was like 8:56 or whatever, about to go to work at ABC, which was downtown. And when the first two planes went in, quickly got myself together, and as I was headed down, could see the plume of smoke from the Pentagon. And, you know, because I was working on a magazine show, it was like, you know, it was an interesting thing, because I made the jump earlier than a lot of people did from network to cable. And one of the reasons I did it was because of the fact that the most precious thing on networks was airtime. Now, in a case like 9/11, obviously they were on the air nonstop, but generally speaking, ABC, a network, and it's still true, would be on 2 hours in the morning from 7 to 9. They'd be on for half an hour in the evening, 5:30 here, and then maybe they have a primetime show or something. And at a cable, they were on the air 24 hours, 7 days a week. And so obviously when a huge story like this broke, particularly if you weren't covering the White House or the Pentagon or something else as a regular matter, and we were all competitive, you were trying to, like, how can I get on the air? How can I get a story? And what I did is I had interviewed a member of the Air National Guard for a completely separate story, the DC Air National Guard, like a year before. And again, this is what I'm talking about, like with the interview with Rahman, you know, your Rolodex became tremendously valuable because you kept all your contacts in there, and I called them up, and I was on the first, they set up a patrol of F-14 fighters over DC because they didn't know if another plane was going to come in, and so I was on the first civilian to be in an F-14 fighter over D.C. And with a camera.
Well, you know what? Let's look at that.
General Dave Worley, a fighter pilot for 30 years and commander of a wing of the District of Columbia Air National Guard, took me up today to join a CAP, or Combat Air Patrol.
How many G's was that?
On the left side.
That was about 2.
For the last 2 days, ABC News got an exclusive first look at one of the units protecting Washington.
So, did you use that camera while you were up there?
Yes.
Where you were flying?
You know how they say, though, people have the right stuff? I had the wrong stuff. Top gun, I was bottom gun. No, it was pretty exciting, but I have to say, I'd never been in a jet fighter before. And they did, you know, it was something of a show and tell. So they had a regular patrol over there, and even though we didn't need it, we were only up probably for like half an hour, we had an aerial refueling. And then there was one point where to get up with the patrol, he had to do a maneuver, he had to do a turn, and suddenly, I think I was pulling 3 or 4 Gs, and it was pretty common that when you came back, you had more in your barf bag than you did when you took off. My barf bag was still empty when I landed, so, but that was, it was pretty cool.
Well, that's a good, I mean, it's a small example, but I mean, it's a good example of what you were talking about earlier about
context.
Well, you know, the life of a reporter, though, is often, you know, there's a miscellany of things that you get to do. I mean, that's one of the things that I think attracted you.
No, absolutely. And, you know, I mean, who knows that you're going to be in an F-14 jet fighter? And I had to spend a whole day before you know, I was only going to be up for half an hour, but I mean, we went through what if the plane went down and how to hit the eject and, you know, my parachute and all of this stuff.
You paid close attention, I'm assuming.
Pardon?
I said you paid close attention to how to get out of the plane. If you
I did, and I thought to myself, if anything really goes wrong, I'm dead.
It's all over.
Yes, I won't survive this.
Did you ever have a similar situation where you got to fly in a fighter or a bomber? You know, after that. No. I mean, or what about a submarine or anything like that? In a ship? You know, I mean,
I'm not Mission Impossible. No, but I mean, you know, you do find yourself in cool places, and actually, even as a presidential correspondent, you would routinely, you know, if you've seen the shows, you land. Sometimes I'd be on Air Force One. There was a rotating pool of people who would be on Air Force One, or else I'd be on the press plane. Then you would run to these Black Hawk helicopters, and you'd go in the back of them, and then you know, follow the president to wherever he was going. So it was interesting. I mean, it was active.
So in 2003, you left ABC to be an anchor at Fox News.
Right.
So why did you make that leap to Fox?
Well, a couple of reasons. I mean, my career, and I, before I left CNN at the very end of 24, I did not have a single day between jobs from when I started at the Boston Globe in September of 1969 until I left CNN in December of 2024. Wow. 55 years employed. And I take great pride in that. But, you know, my career spans really all the changes that we have seen in media, and particularly in broadcast media, because when I started out, there were there were maybe 3 or 4 national newspapers and a bunch of local ones. There were a bunch of affiliates. Then you got to the big city affiliates, and I worked at 2, Chicago and New York. And then there were the 3 networks. There was no cable news. There was no streaming. There was no internet. There was, you know, so it was a very hierarchical, pyramidic system. And, you know, if you were ambitious and reasonably talented, your path that you were going to try to take was pretty well set out. Now it's 2003. The networks are it's odd because 22 years later, they're all still around, but there was very much a feeling in 2003 with the 3 all-news cable channels that the networks were in decline. I remember there was at ABC, there was a lot of talk about managing the decline and sort of the best days of the networks were behind them. And conversely, as I say, I'd sit and watch the TV, and I had several TVs in my office at ABC, and during the day, from 9 o'clock till 6:30, there was no news. It was quiz shows and soap operas and local news. And so if you wanted to watch the news, you had to watch CNN or Fox or MSNBC. And it just struck me at a time when it seemed like the networks were in decline, that sort of, it's an aphorism I have. Sometimes I think the playing it safe is the riskiest thing you can do, and taking a risk is the safest thing you can do. Mm-hmm. And I decided I was going to embrace the change and go to Fox, which is really, I'd have to say, where I think I made my career.
Interesting.
At the age of 55.
Why do you say that?
Because, I think I was pretty well known as a chief White House correspondent for NBC, the #1 rated network at the time. But to be the anchor of the Sunday morning show, and frankly, and to be kind of the truth teller at Fox News, kind of was a really nice situation.
Did you see yourself as the truth teller? I mean, did you consciously?
Well, when I decided I wanted to look around, because, I was still in good shape at ABC, but I just didn't think ABC was in such good shape. Yeah. I went to see Roger Ailes, who was then the head of, and the founder, the creator of Fox News. And I had heard from people that he admired my interviewing style and stuff, and I said, I really would love to come work for you. But just understand, I'm not going to push an agenda. I'm not going to pull any punches. And he asked me one question. He said, can you be as hard on Democrats as you are on Republicans? And I said, yeah. I said, that's my DNA. I sort of like the famous line about the football coach, Vince Lombardi. They asked a lineman one time, is he favored like the quarterback and the running back over the lineman? And the guy said, no, he treats us all like dogs. That was my feeling. Treat them all the politicians like dogs.
I've seen a quote of Ailes that says, where he said that, when he was talking about you, he said that, I have no idea what the man's politics are, but he asked great questions.
Well, and in fairness to them, he kept his promise to me for those 18 years, which was they never questioned a guest that I booked. They never second-guessed or directed me on any question I asked anybody. They just basically said, be tough, be probing, and I did my best.
Well, I have to be honest, with that style and the way you came across and so forth, I would, like Aaron pointed out, I was with Cronkite up until the day he died. And I would go to Martha's Vineyard in the summer and spend some time with him and Betsy. And he'd want to have a scotch at the time that the news was coming on. And I said, well, what channel, what network do you want to watch tonight or whatever? He'd always go eventually to PBS. That was his go-to place.
PBS?
Yeah, PBS. Yeah, the PBS News Hour.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is in the evening news.
Right,
okay.
Right. But not CBS.
No, he wouldn't. He had a little bit of a problem with CBS in those days. But he said, I said, we ever watch Fox? I remember one time he goes, oh my God, are you kidding me? Did you pulling my leg or something? I said, no. The only person I would ever watch on Fox is Chris.
Did he really say that? Wow.
Because
you made my day.
No, and I'm not blowing smoke at you as a donor, okay? This is honest. He didn't like Fox, obviously. You would not be shocked about that, I know. But he felt, I really think he saw you, a little bit of him you know, in you, in the sense that he, as you know, he, even though his politics came out after he retired, and he was much more outgoing about that.
Right.
You know, he had a mania of, I mean, he just would not take political positions.
No, which is why it was so enormous in 1968 when he went to Vietnam, and I know you have all the papers, and came back and said, basically, we've lost the war.
Yeah.
And Lyndon Johnson said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost America.
That's right. Yeah.
The one thing I will say, and I don't mean to tick you off here, I don't think Cronkite, it certainly was true that he didn't betray his politics.
Right.
I don't think he was a particularly good interviewer.
No, he wasn't. He knew it, and he admitted it.
Oh, really? Because you know why? Because you have to not care what people think about you.
Yeah.
And I think Walter, he was Uncle Walter. He was,
That's right.
you know, you have to be a little edgy and sometimes be a little bit of a jerk.
Well,
and
Walter
he
knew
was. I was born for that job.
Walter knew his audience, and I mean the best example probably of Walter's one of his worst interviews, and he was always embarrassed about it. And we talked about it when writing the book. Was in '68 when he interviewed Richard Daley, Mayor Daley.
Yes, right.
Whose goons had beaten up Dan Rather. So CBS, I don't know if it was Stanton or who it was, maybe it was Salant. Because Walter got really hacked off on when Dan was knocked down on the floor, and very un-Walter-like was going, these thugs are being okay, and someone at CBS, I don't recall now, sort of made him do an interview with Daley, and he just threw softballs the whole time, and he was very embarrassed about it. Something, I mean, really all of his life. But he just didn't have the, you know, it's famous for that interview where they talked about Vietnam with President Kennedy a month before Kennedy's assassination. And that was probably one of his best interviews. Anyway, so this is about you, not Walter Cronkite. So let's go, this next clip is a moment from your interview with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin in July of 2018 on Fox.
Mr. President, one of the issues that is standing in the way of more progress, as you know, are the allegations of Russian interference in the U.S. election. You have repeatedly said, and you said again today, that this was not the action of the Russian state, that if it was anything, it was patriotic Russian individuals. I have here the indictment that was presented on Friday from the special counsel Robert Mueller that says that 12 members of Russian military intelligence, the GRU, and they talk specifically about units 26-165 and 74-455. They say, you smile, let me finish. They say that these units were specifically involved in hacking into Democratic Party computers, stealing information, and spreading it to the world to try to disrupt the American election. May I give this to you to look at, sir?
Okay.
See, that's what I meant about you got to be a prick. You just have to be willing to...
Well, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yes.
How did this even happen? Was it, oh, by the way, was it in the Kremlin? Where did you do it?
No, this was done in the Russian embassy in Helsinki. This was literally about an hour after the Trump-Putin summit in Helsinki, Finland, where Trump said that basically sided with Putin over U.S. intelligence as to the fact that he had not been involved in trying to disrupt the 2016 election. And one of the things that I learned working on the magazine show Primetime is it's always good to have a prop. And because of the fact that 3 days before they had, the special counsel had indicted these 12 members of Russian military, I thought, I had my assistant immediately print it up, and I thought, this is a moment. I'll present it to him, and whatever he does, it'll just be interesting. And so I handed it to him, and he looked at me like, you. And And then he just motioned to that, if you saw, there was a table between us. He motioned to that table, like, just put it on the table. I'm not even going to touch this. But the first part of the interview, he affected this thing. He did this a lot in interviews and even meetings with presidents, where he would sort of sit back and slouch like he was the kid in the back of the room who was disinterested. But from that moment on, I was given a half an hour with him. I had his undivided attention. He kind of sat forward, and these piercing blue eyes, and we talked about that, and we talked about Russian involvement in the Civil War in Syria and a variety of other subjects. And it was interesting. I'd had a half an hour, and it was a great interview. And I could have just ended it, but I had one question near the end, and I'm like, it's a really good question, but how far do I want to go? And then I thought, what the hell? So I said to him, Mr. President, why is it that so many of the people who oppose you end up dead? That's the clip I thought you were going to run.
Yeah, that's right.
I did. And he said, well, all of us have domestic problems. And then it's interesting because they always, they like to find what they think is the equivalent to what we think goes on in Russia. He said, was Kennedy killed in America or in Russia? And what about Martin Luther King? So, they like to say bad things happen in your country.
He obviously had read Stalin's quote about no man, no problem.
Right.
Yeah.
One quick story. So before I got the interview, I knew I was going to Helsinki for the summit, and I had always wanted to take my wife on a vacation in that part of the world, so I had booked a vacation to go before I got the Putin interview. And when the interview ended, I brought my wife in, and he was quite professional and friendly. I'm sure he would have killed me if he could have, but in any case.
He didn't ask you to drink anything, or?
No.
Okay.
But I told him that we were going the next day for a week to Russia. And he was very interested, and my wife was a little scared. And I don't know. One of the things that happens with reporters is you just think, you kind of, and that's why people get in trouble. You think you're bulletproof. You sort of think, I'm on the job, I'm doing my job, nothing's going to happen to me. And so we went, and sometimes on the trip, we were going to some of the Tsarist palaces outside St. Petersburg, and we'd be driving along in the car with our guide, and suddenly it would come to a halt because there'd be a traffic jam, not unlike Austin, Texas. And I'd turn to my wife, I'd say, this is where the hit happens. She was not amused by that.
Okay, so you've also done presidential debates.
I have,
of course.
too.
So let's go to this next clip. This is one in this is 2020.
Oh, geez, can't we show 2016?
No, this is the one where you courageously agreed to moderate.
Well, can I just tell a quick story?
Yeah, please,
okay.
Whatever. Yeah.
So, Fox had never been allowed to moderate a debate. The feeling, obviously, was that the Democrats wouldn't go for it. And there was the Independent Commission on Presidential Debates. And they asked me to do the third debate between Trump and Clinton in 2016, the last debate, 19 days before the election. And it went great. It was really good. They were really back and forth. Both camps were very happy with it. They felt it was terrific. Just before the debate, and I must say there was a lot of stress, and because I'd done a lot of other things, and I'd done debates on Fox for primaries and stuff, but 80 million people are going to be watching. So as I'm off stage just before the debate has come in, I literally look up and I go, dear Lord, if you just get me through these next 90 minutes, I promise I will never ask you for anything ever again. So I do the debate, finishes, goes great. I go off stage. I stand in exactly the same place and say, dear Lord, I know what I said 90 minutes ago, but I would love to do another debate in 4 years. This is what happens.
Let's roll the clip here.
Are you willing to tell the American people tonight whether or not you will support either ending the filibuster or packing the court.
Whatever position I take on that, that'll become the issue. The issue is the American people should speak. You should go out and vote. You're in voting now. Vote and let your senators know how strongly you feel. Vote now.
Are you going to pack the
Make
court?
sure you, in fact, let people know
He doesn't want
you're a
to answer the
senator.
question.
I'm not going to answer the question
Why
because
wouldn't you answer that
because
question?
the question
you want to put a lot of
the
new
question
Supreme Court
is
justice,
the
radical
question,
left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
This
Who's
is
on your
so
list?
right.
Gentlemen, I think we've ended this.
He's going to pack the court.
We have
not going to give a list.
We have ended this segment. We're going to move on to the second segment.
That was really a productive segment, wasn't it?
We wanted to end the clip with you with your hands up like
Yes,
that.
yeah. So, be careful what you pray for. So the interesting thing was, it's a little bit like Nixon. I don't especially like to watch myself on TV. So and particularly if I think something went very well. So I loved the 2016 debate, and I was very proud of it. But as I'm preparing for the 2020 debate, the first debate in 2020, I think I got to watch 16 to see. And one of the things that struck me was the degree to which they didn't engage with each other. And, I'd ask a question, and it was almost like simultaneous or consecutive news conferences. Hillary would give an answer, and then Trump would give an answer, and they wouldn't kind of debate each other. So when this debate started, the first debate of 2020, and Trump starts interrupting, I think, great, they're going to engage each other. And then, of course, for those of you who may remember, it turns into a blank show, and literally we had some poor fellow count up afterwards. Trump interrupted Biden and me 145 times in 90 minutes, which even in my math is more than one time a minute. And it just, I stopped in the middle and I said, Mr. President, you agreed to these rules. So you're supposed to have a conversation, not supposed to interrupt. And Trump wouldn't stop. So
Well, you also did interviews with Trump too, and where he kind of misbehaved as well. We saw some other clips, and we decided to go with that one.
Oh, good. But I'm glad I gave you a treasure trove.
Yeah, you were. Yeah.
I can hear, there's going to be a good time at the Briscoe Center.
Yeah. We had one where you looked like you were sitting in a garden or something, and Trump, of course, you asked him a question. That's fake news, Chris. What are you at? It was typical kind of Trump behavior. Right. And you actually said, no, it's not. It's not. It's true.
No, actually, and he went and got stuff, and I was right and he was wrong. Yeah. Which is why some people think he tried to get me in this debate.
You were in an impossible situation there.
I was.
Let's face it. So.
And I made the worst of it.
No. So, all right. So in December of 2021, you announced your departure from Fox News, and so why did you decide to leave Fox News?
This is probably. It's a perfectly legitimate question. It's the hardest thing to answer because I really loved Fox News. There were certainly, I was aware of problems with it and stuff, but I loved the way they treated me, and there was a family. I'd been there for 18 years. What really happened was that after the 2020 election, and if you remember, I'm sure you don't remember, but what happened was in the 2020 election, Trump was winning the states he was winning, and Biden was winning the states. Hillary was winning, but there hadn't been, none of the swing states had turned. And about midnight, Fox called Arizona for Biden, and that was the first state that one person had won, one party had won in the previous election, and the other party didn't. And Trump went nuts, and the audience, or the Fox base audience, went nuts. And in the aftermath of that, a lot of people stopped watching Fox, and Fox, which had been #1 for over 10 years, suddenly was in trouble. And all of that is prelude to saying that I think Fox got scared. It didn't affect me, but the programming really changed. Had it been tilted right? Sure, absolutely. But suddenly, it seemed like it was running amok, and they started pushing. absolutely nobody believed it, but some people, I never did, started pushing the theory that the election was stolen, and that's when the whole Dominion lawsuit case started. And Tucker Carlson was riding high, and he was saying that after January 6th, that it wasn't a riot, it was and I just couldn't stomach it anymore. They weren't making me do it, but it was like the pond, the fishbowl I was swimming in was no longer sustainable.
Thank you for that's. I know that's a hard
yes.
question.
It's hard. I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable question. It's personally painful because I didn't want to leave Fox, but I felt that Fox had changed.
Yeah, I mean, you were there 18 years.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's end on something a little happier. The next thing we're going to watch is an interview that you did. It's a wonderful interview that you did with Jean-Baptiste, I guess is the best way to say it. So let's run that.
Take us a little bit inside your process. When you're sitting at the keyboard, how do you create?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think it comes from a place of you're inspired by an idea. You're inspired by something. Something comes to you. And when you're inspired in that way, it's like a clue. It's telling you, follow this clue, and it may lead you somewhere. Sometimes it doesn't. But okay, I'm here. So that's telling me more and more what it wants to be. The key is to listen and just be the vessel for the idea to come through.
And were you just doing that?
I mean, that was just, no, that was spontaneous composition, if you want to call it that. I'm just making that up, man.
And honestly, was that something or was that not something?
That's great. That was a wonderful interview.
It was a great interview. One of the things that he did is he was talking about genres of music and how you could play music of one genre in another genre, and he took a little I forget whether it was Bach or Beethoven, and he played it in the classical way, and then he played it as ragtime, and then he played it as jazz, and it was. But the thing that I remember there, and I love doing those interviews with some of the people I got to talk to. I didn't love all of them because some of the times, you just had to do an interview and you had to book somebody, but I was really excited about him. One of the things I noticed, and maybe you picked up there, and I asked him about it, he kind of cocked his head, and I said, it almost feels like you're listening. And he said that. He said the music kind of comes to him. I mean, it was almost like instead of he was creating it, it was like he was a vessel for the music to come through. It was almost like a divine inspiration, and that was,
that comes out.
To do. Incidentally, those interviews still exist on HBO Max. Those interviews, to get to sit down with a really interesting person, like interesting that a couple of them come to mind were composers. John Williams, the great movie composer. John Batiste, Harrison Ford, Neil deGrasse Tyson. To get to sit with a really interesting person where there was no time limit. I mean, we weren't going to go for 2 hours. It wasn't Joe Rogan, but but we'd go for 45 minutes or 50 minutes, and maybe cut it down a little bit. That was just such a treat. Such a delight.
There were great interviews, and they're available now on HBO Max.
Yeah.
So those of you who can get to HBO Max, I recommend them heavily. And we've gone over our time, and the reason is because you're such a fascinating interview, Chris, and you've had such a fascinating life as a journalist. And again, I want to thank you for your generous gift and coming here and being with us. And we want to see you here again.
You bet.
Okay,
You bet.
very
And
good.
thank you, and thank all of you. This has been my delight.